Welcome to today's webinar about choosing the best authentication protocol for your business case. Please note that all attendees are on mute, and we do encourage questions, so please use the GoToWebinar toolbar to ask questions and give comments, and they will be answered at the end of this webinar. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. My name is Jesse Kurtto, and I work as a Technology Partnership Manager here at Ubisecure. And with me is Mr. Keith Ubel, Vice President of Customer Success.
Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here today.
First, a short word about authentication versus authorization. And the difference is a bit more than just a couple of letters. Authentication is all about the user, who the current user is, and how that was proven. For example, by logging in via a username, a password, the user knows a secret-like password which proves who the current user is.
And then authorization is all about access rights. So what the user can do within an application and what applications they can access by what devices. Now let's have a look at the timeline of different protocols used for web single sign-on and for identity and access management. Yes, sir.
So we can see here that SAML recently celebrated its 16th-year-old birthday and is by far eldest of the three protocols that we will be going through today.
SAML developed over time, and the current implementation is what we call SAML 2.0, and that has its roots back in 2005. Although that standard was ratified, the core standard was ratified in 2005, there's been continuous development since then, but things have been winding down for that protocol. In place has been coming a newcomer to the scene, first OpenID, and from that was born OAuth 2 and on to OpenID Connect. And we'll talk about the differences between these three protocols in today's webinar.
All right, so let's start in chronological order from SAML 2.0. So SAML has a long history behind it. It has roots in single sign-on for browser-based applications. And it has very nice advantage that it provides both authentication and authorization.
And it's a combined industry standard formed to make sure that products work together for all of the players in the ecosystem, for applications connecting to identity providers. So we'll all follow a standard rulebook.
And if you're looking to join existing large federations, then SAML will have the edge, as each age means many of the existing federations are SAML-based. For example, most university federations.
And these federation networks are really great that newcomers to the federation can very quickly download complete configuration information to allow them to automatically configure themselves, to be aware when members leave or join the federation, and to update their rules accordingly. This is great for things like universities or schools, in the public sector, across different departments. It's a really great way to automate the configuration of a trust network.
And looking at SAML 2 trade-offs, we already mentioned the already existing big user base, product base, wide enterprise support, and of course, it's 16 years old. It's a major security-focused protocol.
So this means it's been examined many times by many parties. It's been adapted throughout the history of the protocol. It's extensible, so it can adopt new ways to sign and encrypt documents as those technologies evolve. But there are some downsides.
Yes. For example, SAML 2 is quite a verbose protocol. It exchanges fairly large XML messages fairly often. And this doesn't fit so well with modern web-based applications where you want to minimize the number of round trips.
But the biggest problem at the moment is that the protocol is really no longer being actively developed. There is still work going on, of course, and it's still widely used and in use every day with millions and millions of users. But a lot of focus for new development has moved on to other protocols.
And first of these newer protocols is OAuth 2. And in stark contrast with SAML, OAuth is purely an authorization protocol, what you can do, instead of an authentication protocol, who you are.
And OAuth 2 is quite a technical low-level specification about the communications between the different parties. And it defines different grant types, which all parties have to then implement in the same way. So in some cases, if a product or API says it uses OAuth 2, you can't really be sure what they mean.
And talking about identity and access management, OAuth 2 can help solve the access part, but for the identity part, it's been increasingly being used in conjunction with OpenID Connect. But before we jump into OpenID Connect, let's first go through some typical use cases for pure OAuth 2.
One of the first use cases is acting on behalf of a user. And this can be, for example, a software agent having permission to do something on the user's behalf, which is typically done in cases where a user gives access to a third party to some resource, and that third-party software is then accessing that resource with the user's permission to perform a certain task. That task could be anything, and it could be something that's done while the user's asleep or the user's not present, and it's a typical API use case.
Another typical use case is user-managed access, or UMA, which is simply a profile of OAuth 2.
And UMA is all about, or UMA, is all about sharing data between different parties with the permission of how that data is going to be used and who it can be given to.
Looking deeper for OAuth 2 trade-offs, first point is that many software as a service-based applications have differing transaction costs depending on the protocol used, and typically OAuth 2 is on the lower end of that spectrum.
It's also a very lightweight and concise protocol, so it's been optimized for speed of a web where the network may be slow or sometimes unreliable. And in some of the flows, it has fewer round trips than the equivalent, for example, SAML protocol calls.
And one special point of interest are the bearer tokens often used with OAuth 2. And they have great power, but with them comes great responsibility. In a way, bearer tokens are like car keys. Whichever application holds those car keys can act on your behalf, whether you are currently logged in or not.
So OAuth 2 as a low-level protocol requires quite a lot of awareness around security in order to implement it without putting yourself or your company at risk.
The third protocol today is OIDC, or OpenID Connect. It is the successor and the replacement for the now defunct OpenID 2 protocol. And like the UMA mentioned previously, it is a profile of OAuth 2.
So profile means like a handbook or a way of implementing OAuth 2, a set of rules that all parties using that protocol follow to allow those systems to work together. It's rules about how to present requests and responses, the meaning of the different attributes in those messages, and then a set of rules around security, for example.
And OIDC is often used in conjunction with OAuth because it can bring authentication in add-on to authorization provided by OAuth.
And some of the typical use cases for OpenID Connect today is for SSO, for customer services, for customer systems, single sign-on for web applications, so that a customer can move between different web applications and stay signed in without having to sign on again and again, even when those web applications may be owned by different services. It's also very common for mobile apps, so a way for apps such as Android or iOS applications to perform authentication and authorization for their users. And more, it's being used in conjunction with devices, so IoT use cases, when a device may not have even a user interface for a user to interact with, but still enable that device to get the permissions to access data that the user has granted access to.
Yeah, that's a great example of a non-interactive use case.
So some of the pros and cons of OpenID Connect, being a much newer protocol, it's taken into account a lot of the improvements in the modern web browsers and the modern web protocols. So it's much more easier to implement, for example, for HTML5 applications or single-page web applications using modern technologies such as JavaScript.
Yes, there are many great libraries offering OIDC support, fairly easy to add on to an existing web application when compared to SAML. And as mentioned before, it builds on top of the existing OAuth 2 protocol. And as such, it can avoid the SAML, if we can call this software as a service application tax in per user per month costs in many online platforms.
We've noticed that many online platforms, they charge companies more money to use SAML as an identity protocol as compared to OpenID Connect. For what reason, we're unsure, but it's a premium that they put on the SAML protocol. And for companies with large volumes of users or large numbers of transactions, it may be a significant factor in choosing how to connect and which protocol to use when federating with that service.
That is definitely something to consider. Now on the downsides, OIDC doesn't yet have the long history, proven track record of SAML, so some may not call it as mature. And of course, this also means that it's still being actively developed, expanding, and unfortunately, this also means that it's steadily but surely getting more complex, approaching SAML.
Early on, it was seen as a easier version of the older protocols, but as use cases demanded it, there's more and more complexity as security requires in-depth checking. For example, having requests to be signed and encrypted, same for responses, to add another layer of security to the model. But it's a standard developed by industry and volunteers in an open setting, and it's the users of the protocol and the industry who help develop it, and they develop it according to the needs of the market. So it's developed based on basically demand.
Ever-growing demand. Yes. Now, to conclusions. If the best camera is the camera that you're carrying with you, the best protocol is what your existing systems already use.
So if you're using a SaaS application and that SaaS application supports SAML and nothing else, of course, you should choose that. If you're given a choice, for example, if an application supports one or the other, in most cases, the difference of security, if implemented correctly, will be negligible. So then you should look at the financials to see which service is more affordable depending on the protocol.
Yes, and be sure to check the pricing of any software as a service providers, your cloud providers. Some of them charge much more for each SAML federated user than for example, OIDC.
And if you have in-house applications which are developed through your own development or outsourced development, you should choose a protocol that works with the toolkit on programming languages, development environment that you develop with. Modern tools will support both SAML or OpenID Connect, typically out of the box. But you should see what is supported by the framework and used by your services.
Yeah, it's important to get the ball rolling quickly here, because centralized IEM reaps more and more benefits as more target systems are integrated to it. So don't strive for 100% coverage on day one, but build from bottom to top.
It's also possible to mix and match these protocols together in an environment. So you might have legacy applications using SAML protocol, newer applications using OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect. You can connect them all to an identity server which supports these multiple protocols and handles the translation between the different protocols. The Ubisecure identity server is one such product for doing that protocol translation, which lets you choose the protocol which best fits the business unit using the target system, using the protocols that they have already.
And with the ever increasing importance of information security, it's good to keep in mind that the security of a protocol is often highly dependent on its implementation, not the protocol itself.
So that requires in-depth understanding of the protocol at a very technical level, but also in-depth testing of the product itself, and testing of that product against the components that it integrates with. So complete end-to-end testing is important for the secure environment.
All right, thank you for attention. And now it's time to start the Q&A part of this webinar. So please use the GoToWebinar toolbar to ask questions, give feedback, and share your ideas with us. All right, I already see a couple of questions here, so let's get started right away. The first one is that are there any differences between the protocols with regards to user consent management? And it's a really good question. We are now living in the post-GDPR world, and while the May deadline has passed already, and hopefully some anxiety with it, the GDPR itself is and will be here to stay with us for years to come. So back to the question itself. Due to its age, the SAML specification doesn't have a user consent flow, even though, of course, one could be built in the logging flow itself. And now, on the other hand, the OIDC specification expects the user to provide consent to share their profile details, which, when properly implemented, meets all the latest privacy regulations like the GDPR. And into the end, though, we should keep in mind that while a centralized IEM platform will definitely help with GDPR compliance, it's not a magic bullet. All right, I see we've got a second question here. The question is SAML or OAuth 2 more trustworthy for authorization? And this is a bit complex question to answer. One must be very careful here to distinguish between the trustworthiness of identities and the trustworthiness of assertions by protocols. And to put it briefly, SAML builds the trust relation by digitally signing the exchange XML files, while OAuth 2 builds the trust relation on direct TLS protected HTTP calls from the application to the identity provider. So summa summarum, both rest on strong cryptography and are trustworthy when correctly implemented. All right, I see no further questions for now. So that concludes our Q&A session today. And I wish to thank you all for attending this webinar today. And we have a new hands-on blog about single-page applications and OpenID Connect coming up soon. So please subscribe to our newsletter to get notified when it gets live.